all of you. My name is Florencia Jimenez, and as part of the MA program in English of Facultad de Lenguas, Universidad Nacional de Córdoba, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Scott Slovic. The title of his presentation today is Practicing the Environmental Humanities in the Age of COVID-19, Empirical, Ecocriticism, Precarity, and the Power of Story. Before I actually yield the floor to our guest speaker today, I'd like to mention just a few of Dr. Slovic's bio points. Dr. Slovic is an expert in the field of ecocriticism, what today's lecture revolves around, and one that has awoken great interest, as you can see from the large audience participating in the event today. Scott Slovic is University Distinguished Professor of Environmental Humanities at the University of Idaho, the United States of America. He served as founding president of the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment from 1992 to 1995, and from 1995 to 2020 was the editor-in-chief of ISLE, Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and Environment. The author, editor, and co-editor of numerous books in the environmental humanities, his forthcoming volumes include Nature and Literary Studies, Cambridge University Press 2022, and the Bloomsbury Handbook to Medical Environmental Humanities, Bloomsbury Academic 2022. He is the series co-editor of Routledge Studies in World Literatures and Environment and Routledge Environmental Humanities. Last but not least, Dr. Slovic has been a guest lecturer at Universidad Nacional de Córdoba on different occasions, and we are very glad to have him here with us again. I would also like to add that Dr. Maria Jose Buteler, who is a member of the academic committee of the program and is an expert in literary studies, is here with us today and will run the question and answer session after the presentation. Thank you very much, Maria Jose. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Slovic.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, even virtually. And I hope that you'll find it interesting to have me share a few ideas of the latest research that I'm doing and that some of my colleagues are doing in the environmental humanities. So let me try to set up my screen. So you heard Florencia mention that much of the work in the environmental humanities is associated with interdisciplinary studies. Even when we're doing literary studies, we're often trying to incorporate perspectives from other disciplines in a way that we hope will be helpful. And this is what I'll be talking about today. The ecocriticism, or ecological literary studies, tends to focus fairly precisely on cultural texts, literary texts, film, music, visual art, and other kinds of artistic texts. The environmental humanities are somewhat broader than literary studies per se. And for the past decade and a half or so, 15 years perhaps, many of us who once did ecocriticism began to think of ourselves as environmental humanities scholars, because we recognized the fact that really our work was branching from field to field within the humanities and sometimes beyond the humanities. And so we needed a broader term to describe our work. So first, I'd like to say a few words in general about the practice of the environmental humanities during the pandemic that we're still in the middle of. Before the talk began, we were discussing the current state of the pandemic in Argentina, and it seems as if there are perhaps not so very many cases right now. The same feels true here in the Western United States, where I am. I'm speaking to you right now from the state of Oregon, from my hometown of Eugene, Oregon, which is where I live, even though I teach in the neighboring state of Idaho. during the pandemic, I've been able to use Zoom and to teach my classes in the way that I'm now speaking to you. So our academic work in general has changed in the way we use virtual platforms during the pandemic, but also certainly the field of ecocriticism and the environmental humanities have changed dramatically. The photograph on my first slide is from 1 year ago, May 2021, when I was a visiting scholar for several weeks at a university in Turkey. And this is a group of people who were attending one of my lectures. It was my first in-person lecture since the beginning of the pandemic, more than a year before. And we were all wearing masks. During my lecture, I took off my mask, but all of the audience members wore masks throughout my this particular lecture. My other lectures in Turkey were delivered over Zoom, even though I was there in person. So in a lot of ways, we've had to accustom ourselves to a different world. So shortly after the pandemic began in spring of 2020, a Swedish website called Bifrost did a special symposium, a collection of articles on environmental humanities responses to the pandemic. It was early in the pandemic at that time, so most of us did not have a clear sense of the meaning of the pandemic, but we all did our best, about 12 of us who wrote these articles, we did our best to gather our thoughts and try to describe what we anticipated the pandemic to mean for society or for the planet during its early days. And the centerpiece of that collection of articles on environmental humanities responses to the pandemic was an open letter. And here you can see a screenshot of it, an environmental humanities response to the COVID pandemic, an open letter. It was the letter was drafted by ecofeminist scholar Greta Gard. And then many of us signed the letter to say that we agreed with many of these basic ideas. And essentially, the point of the open letter was to try to think of how we could benefit from the pandemic in order to do our work better in the environmental humanities, to be more mindful, more thoughtful in the way we lived our lives and conducted our work. And two of the most important ideas were the ones that I've indicated on this slide, that we stopped traveling to fly to conferences because nobody was traveling at the beginning of the pandemic, but actually we began to learn that we could accomplish much of our intellectual work virtually and through email and other kinds of systems. We didn't really have to travel as much as we had been, even though we missed the chance to spend time with friends and have meaningful cultural experiences. We could still do our work effectively and save a lot of fossil fuels if we stopped flying so much. And then the second one, the key point from this letter was that we should actually think about our diets, and that one of the lessons of the pandemic was that our relationships with other species really do matter. They're consequential, not only in the zoonotic transfer of disease, but in various other ways. Our lives are connected with other lives, the lives of other species on the planet. And one of the most meaningful connections we have with other species is through what we eat. And I understand, I've been to Argentina, of course, I understand that eating animals is an important part of many cultures around the world. Nonetheless, eating animals is often not the best way to use our land, or in various other ways, there are consequences of having these kinds of relationships with other species. And the pandemic provided an occasion to think deeply about these relationships with other animals. My own contribution to that collection of articles for Bifrost was a short article that I titled "COVID World, COVID Mind, Toward a New Consciousness." And I based many of my ideas on a book from 1989 that I've indicated here on this slide by the population biologist Paul Ehrlich and the neuroscientist Robert Ornstein, called New World, New Mind Toward a Conscious Evolution. The idea for them was that the world has changed due to our technological actions, and we need to try to think in a new way in order to respond effectively to this altered reality, this new world that we have created through our technological advances. Likewise, it was my sense early in the pandemic that somehow we were establishing a new relationship with the world, and we should try to learn as much as possible from this new relationship. And for me, one of the most important ideas, I've listed it here, number one, of my four major ideas, is that we had a growing sense of universal vulnerability. Universal vulnerability. And in the title of my lecture and in some of the later slides, I'm going to be talking about precarity, something called precarity. I tend to use vulnerability and precarity interchangeably, even though I think they're slightly different. But basically, many of us began to feel vulnerable in a way that we had never felt before in our lives. And everything felt dangerous. Talking to our neighbors, buying groceries, being in a group outside seemed like a very dangerous thing to do. And the sense of great vulnerability, it occurred to me, was actually a valuable thing, something that could be helpful as we continued our lives. And then a few of my other key ideas were that we were increasingly aware as a result of the pandemic of how the human mind is insensitive to exponential change. That the way the pandemic seemed to start slowly, and then before we knew it, there were many, many cases. This is an exponential pattern that begins slowly and gradually and then rapidly increases until we're overwhelmed by the number of cases. And many other important phenomena in the world, such as global climate change, seem to progress very slowly, as if there's no change at all. And then before we know it, the consequences of climate change are overwhelming, and we feel as if there's nothing that can be done. And by becoming aware of the human mind's insensitivity to exponential change, we might be able to guard against this tendency to be flat-footed, to respond too slowly to important risks in the world. The third point had to do with growing awareness that our interactions with the animal world, with other species, have genuine consequences for human beings. And then number four is, what does it mean to stop everything, to stop business as usual, life as usual, in order to make some necessary changes? And I refer to it as putting on the socio-cultural brakes, as in the brakes of a car, coming to a stop and doing things in a new way. And at the time, in 2020, I thought that maybe we could actually move in a different direction, but it now appears in 2022 as if we're more or less returning to our previous pre-pandemic lives, which is a little bit disappointing to me. So one of the most powerful ideas in the environmental humanities in the past decade is Rob Nixon's notion of slow violence. He articulated this in his book from 2011, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. And basically what he's referring to is the slowness and imperceptibility of forms of destructive action, destructive processes, not just cutting down trees or killing individual animals, but extinction is a large, slow, gradual process. Global climate change and plastic pollution of the oceans and the spread of toxins in the air and water and soil, all of these are very slow and invisible. We can't easily see things that occur gradually and out of sight. And yet, ironically, many of the most important and worrisome problems in the environment are slow. They're gradual and they're out of sight. And so the challenge of environmental communicators is to try to help audiences be sensitive to these phenomena that we can't perceive with our normal senses. So I'm interested in the idea that not only literature about climate change and about extinction and other types of environmental topics, but also pandemic literature and then climate literature might inspire positive thinking, or what we would call pro-social thinking about how to support society, whether these cultural texts might encourage such thinking among readers. And so for me, as I suggested earlier, the feeling of precarity, the worry about our own vulnerability and the vulnerability of the planet is actually a positive state of mind, because it means we're more careful and more sensitive. So one of the key thinkers about precarity is an Indian scholar named Pramod K. Nayar, who's published 2 books on precarity, the first of which is Bhopal's Ecological Gothic, Disaster, Precarity, and the Biopolitical Uncanny from 2017, where he defines precarity or precariousness as the effect of an exposure to the world which causes injury. And in this case, he's writing about the industrial disaster from 1984 in the southern Indian city of Bhopal, where a very poisonous gas leaked from a factory and killed tens of thousands of people in one day. And then during the decades following the accident have continued to cause health effects with people and other kinds of environmental effects. So a terrible disaster that has produced an entire literature and an artistic tradition, photography and film and other media, representing the toxic disaster of Bhopal. And so it's a powerful example of precarity that has been represented in literature and art. Nayar went on 2 years later and published another book, Ecocriticism, Vulnerable Lives in Literature and Culture, in which he extended the concept of precarity from human beings to the larger planet. And he says, precarity enables us to recognize the contingent nature, the fragile, uncertain nature of the earth, the beauty, fragility, and singularity of the planet we inhabit, which we stand to lose if we do not take care of our only home. So precarity, as Nayar is using the term, and as I also use it, is a way of becoming sensitive to the fragility and importance of phenomena ranging from human life to ecological health. And when we have an awareness of precarity, we're more likely to live cautiously, to conduct our individual lives, and to develop public policies that enable us to try not to lose things that we value. So a couple well-known scholars, Ramachandra Guha and Joan Martinez Alier from Spain, in an essay called Varieties of Environment, in a book called Varieties of Environmentalism, once articulated the difference between environmentalism in the global north and environmentalism in the global south. The global north, the relatively industrialized and developed parts of the world, he referred to as places that practice full stomach environmentalism. That means people in these societies are looking for the opportunity to experience the beauty of nature and the fascination of nature, to enjoy nature, in other words. And people in the global South, they wrote, experience empty belly environmentalism, which means a scarcity of resources and the danger of living near toxic situations, downwind or downstream, or in otherwise hazardous conditions. And so what I'm thinking is that it would be useful if people in the global North developed a healthy sense of precarity, a new mindfulness that would enable people who use the vast majority of the Earth's resources to use those resources more carefully and maybe to use less of those resources, so as to have a lighter impact on the environment. And I'm wondering whether pandemic literature and art, and as well as other types of literary texts, such as climate change literature, might enable us to develop this healthy sense of precarity. So in recent years, literary scholars have begun doing empirical studies of the impacts of particular narratives on audiences. An empirical study is the kind of work that social scientists do, where they design experiments and they gather data. You know, they actually test hypotheses rather than simply making assumptions. In literary studies, traditionally, the individual scholar has read a text, either a small text like a poem or a short story, or a larger text such as a novel. And then the individual scholar has tried to interpret the text and explain the meaning of the text. The difference between the traditional approach and the empirical approach is that the empirical approach gathers information about audience responses from a much larger number of people, and thus seems to have a somewhat better chance of determining the true impact of such a text upon its audience. And so when I write about the power of story, in the title of this lecture, the last part of my title is the power of story, we assume that story has a certain power, that it's a particularly effective way of moving an audience. But we're not actually sure what the power of story is. And I would agree with these scholars who are taking this new empirical approach that it's important for us to develop a clearer, more scientific understanding of what happens when we are exposed to story. Three of the leaders in this field of empirical literary studies, especially ecocritical studies from an empirical perspective, are Matthew Schneider-Meyerson, an American scholar who has been teaching in Singapore in recent years, Alexa Weik von Mosner, a German professor who teaches at a university in Austria, and Wojciech Małecki, who is a Polish professor working at Wrocław University in Poland. And they describe this work as empirically grounded, an empirically grounded interdisciplinary approach to environmental narrative, combining social, scientific, and humanistic methodologies to ground, that means to put firmly on the ground, to refine, and to test common claims about influence and impact, using interviews, focus groups, surveys, and even controlled experiments where special types of texts are created and then audiences are exposed to those texts and then given surveys and other kinds of diagnostic measures in order to determine how people are thinking. So my own work on the trying to determine the power of story and the psychological effects of story have a lot to do with the psychology of insensitivity and how we might overcome insensitivity. So I'm interested in such concepts as psychic numbing, the idea that we are quickly overwhelmed by large-scale phenomena, by numbers larger than the number one, in fact, and that this leads to a potentially tragic insensitivity to large-scale human crises, like victims of war, refugees, and then many of the important environmental crises that I mentioned earlier, including climate change, are on a scale that is so big that we have difficulty appreciating it and responding to it. And then pseudo-inefficacy, the feeling that we can't make any difference, so why should we even respond to these large crises? And then various other psychological phenomena that are recorded in this book that I did with Paul Slovic called Numbers and Nerves, Information, Emotion, and Meaning in a World of Data, a book that came out in 2015. So one of the key psychological ideas is that if we were completely rational, if human beings were completely rational, then every life would be worth the same as any other life, and that you would have a linear way of representing or of modeling the value of lives. One life would equal 1 unit of value, 2 lives would equal 2 units, and so forth. It would be a straight line. Or you might recognize, if you were being really rational about this, that the more lives that are in danger, the more valuable those lives become. It would be exponential in a rising way, because if more lives are in jeopardy, an entire society might be in danger, or a colony of bees would be facing critical colony collapse. So large losses threaten this viability of an entire group. And so perhaps from a rational perspective, the value of lives should increase as we're talking about larger and larger numbers. In reality, just a moment. In reality, we quickly become desensitized to the number of lives as we move from 1 to 2. We care less about 2 lives than we care about 1 life. And I think this has this, which psychologists call singularity. The singularity principle has particular promise as we talk about the power of story in fields like ecocriticism and other branches of literary studies, because if we can focus attention on individual lives, we can inspire people to pay attention and to care in a way that may not happen when we're talking about larger groups. But we need to do more studies of this in order to figure out how best to use story in order to cultivate appropriate concern. In fact, I just had a meeting this morning with a filmmaker with a nonfiction documentary filmmaker who's done a number of well-known films in the United States. And he wanted to learn more about the psychology of psychic numbing and pseudo-inefficacy in order to use these ideas more effectively in his filmmaking and tell stories that would convey larger phenomena, but to do so by way of singular representation of these phenomena. So we assume that we can overcome the psychological tendencies toward insensitivity by communicating multidimensionally in many different forms of communication, through images, through storytelling, through personalized faces and narratives, and also by understanding the psychological processes by which we process or respond to information. If we're aware of our tendency not to be sensitive, we might be able to overcome that process to some extent, because we see ourselves becoming, or we feel ourselves becoming, insensitive. Much of this information is based that I've worked on work that I've done with my father, who's a prominent psychologist in cognitive science, decision-making, risk perception. We published the book that I mentioned earlier in 2015, and then expanded this book into a website. And this is the link to the website, arithmeticofcompassion.org, in which we describe the key concepts of the psychology of human sensitivity to information, and also several key concepts in the environmental humanities, including slow violence, which I mentioned earlier. as part of my contribution to what I've called the fifth wave of eco-criticism, which means taking eco-critical ideas to the public, not simply writing in a theoretical way or in a completely scholarly way about literary texts or other kinds of cultural texts. I've produced blog entries for this website, interviews with writers, and commentaries on various other publications or film reviews in order to try to make publicly accessible ideas related to the psychology of sensitivity and insensitivity. The fifth wave of eco-criticism has to do with speaking or writing for broader audiences rather than narrow scholarly audiences. So recently I worked with a woman, an Ethiopian woman now in Switzerland, who, to help her as she prepared a testimony statement, a statement about her own life experience for the Arithmetic of Compassion website about the plight of her family in Tigray. So writing personal testimony is a very important way of taking a larger phenomenon, in this case, a humanitarian crisis, and presenting it on a smaller human level to make people pay attention and care about this phenomenon rather than just ignoring it as something that's abstract and far away. That testimony was published on the website a few months ago. More recently, I interviewed a Canadian doctoral student in anthropology who also has a degree in creative writing, specifically on not just empathy for human beings, but on trans-species empathy. She's a specialist in writing about whales and what it might take for human beings to be more sensitive to a whale's perspective on the world. In particular, I became interested in Amy Donovan's work when I read her article called Raw, Dense, and Loud, A Whale's Perspective on Cold Water Energy, which is in a new book, Cold Water Oil. This just came out this year. And essentially, she's writing about oil exploration in the North Seas, off the coast of Canada, and the effects of this exploration, underwater exploration for oil, the effects on whales and other sea creatures, but particularly whales. And at one point in the interview, Amy Donovan writes, "Stories transport us and change us. They are one way to make that leap of empathetic imagination possible." So she definitely believes that by telling stories about individual humans and about other species, we might trigger the empathetic imagination of audiences. So she's a believer in the power of story. The problem is we don't really know how powerful story might be. So scholars like me, who've been trained in traditional literary analysis to sit by ourselves in a room or in the library and study texts and then to develop interpretations of these texts, many of us are now creating empirical approaches, designing empirical studies to understand how narrative works and how it helps us to understand certain phenomena in the world. So this is, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a study that I've been developing with various colleagues in the United States and elsewhere in the world, in order to appreciate how narratives help us respond to the pandemic or to pandemics in general. So my question is, how does reading a pandemic-related prompt change people's sense of personal vulnerability or personal precarity? So if you read a piece of literature about a pandemic, and there's an entire genre of literature called plague literature or pandemic literature, does it change the way you might think about your own personal precarity, not just in an abstract imaginative sense, but also in relation to your real physical life in the world? And I'm actually interested in whether reading pandemic literature might make us more sensitive in relation to other kinds of ecological crises, such as climate change. So can you read a pandemic novel and become more concerned about climate change and begin to contemplate changing your life in such a way as to reduce the risk of ongoing climate change? So here's a particular passage from one of the pandemic novels that I use in my own research. This is a 2011 novel by Peter Heller, an American writer. It's called The Dog Stars. And it's about an influenza pandemic that kills most of the people in the world. And this man is living with his dog, otherwise almost without exposure to other human beings. And in this scene, he's remembering the death of his wife as she's dying from the influenza. And she's very, very sick, in terrible discomfort. And she's actually asking him to smother her with a pillow because she's so desperate and so uncomfortable. And so it's a terrible scene. It's a scene of absolute vulnerability, absolute precarity. And my question is, if readers look at this and think about it for a few minutes, will it remind them of the possibility that any of us might be susceptible to disease in such a way that we should be careful to avoid contracting the disease and doing other things that might lead to extreme vulnerability? So what I'm interested in applying the theory of narrative contagion to the study of pandemic literature. Several psychologists in this study that I've mentioned here from 2014 suggest that emotional states can be transferred to others via emotional contagion, and that text-based communication, whether from a novel or a film or other kinds of texts, might actually infect readers with the emotions of the text. And so it's interesting, kind of somewhat ironic, to be using pandemic literature, which is about viral contagion, but actually to think of the story as something that might be contagious as well. However, I think of narrative contagion as a positive thing, potentially a positive thing, if we can inspire pro-social thinking that will lead readers to try to be more careful and to try to do helpful things for society. This is related, narrative contagion is related somewhat to Suzanne Keen's thinking about empathy and the novel. She's the one who developed the idea of mirror neurons, the notion that neurons in our brains are affected by our exposure to story. And that so something happens organically in our brains that makes us feel a kind of attachment to characters, usually to human characters, when we're reading a literary text, such as a novel. So I'm working with a communication studies scholar named David Markowitz for this project on narrative contagion, where we're applying for funding now, but we hope to expose research subjects, human subjects, to passages of pandemic narratives, and then to give them various questionnaires and writing assignments, such as this prompt, where we ask them to imagine the world after the pandemic as a result of their exposure to a pandemic text, wondering whether they might present a narrative that would suggest a kind of a sense of cautious precarity as a result of this new sense of sensitivity or vulnerability, followed by exposure to a narrative. So it's become a truism in literary studies to think that art can play a positive role in influencing society, to contemplate and occasionally enact improvements towards social justice and environmental consciousness. But we don't actually know in any kind of firm sense whether this is really the case. And this is one of the goals of empirical ecocriticism. that I'm trying to do and that other scholars are attempting to do. So literary texts, like other artistic texts, present complex, multi-layered affective or emotional information. It's not always clear what readers will find resonant and memorable in these texts. We don't, a real literary text doesn't have a simple message. It often has multiple messages. It's multi-layered. So we can't feel confident necessarily that we are going to have the effect that we're aiming to have when we expose people to these texts. So stories can be a potent way or a poignant way of reaching audiences, but an imprecise way to guide pro-social thinking. And sometimes the message of an artistic text can get lost in the emotional noise, or what scholars would say, the affective noise of the text. So actually, I just moderated a lecture a few days ago by one of the creators of the COVID-19 vaccine. He's a biochemist at the University of British Columbia, and he studies something called lipid nanoparticles, and he studies the way microscopic bits of fat can carry substances across cellular borders. And it was one of the mechanisms that was used for mRNA vaccines, basically as a technology for delivering medicine. Likewise, I think in the environmental humanities, we're kind of interested in whether certain types of stories might be a technology for delivering pro-social ideas related to humanitarian and environmental concerns. One of the scholars who studied climate literature in an empirical way is Matthew Schneider-Meyerson. And in this special cluster of articles on empirical ecocriticism that appeared in the 2020 cluster in ISLE, the journal that I was editing at the time, he studies the influence of literature on readers' awareness of climate justice and the perception of migrants or immigrants. And he particularly focused on a novel called The Water Knife, a well-known work of climate fiction written by Paolo Bacigalupi. And he found that readers of this novel, he conducted a survey online through a system called Amazon Turk, which is through Amazon.com, but it's an empirical survey mechanism that is available from that platform. He found that many people read this novel and they felt worry, sadness, and fear as a result of it, and these are likely the emotions that the author wanted them to fear, because he creates a dystopian, negative portrayal of the near future where water is extremely scarce due to climate change. So surely he wants people to worry about this and become more concerned about it. However, he also, Schneider-Meyerson, discovered that The Water Knife created a complex message for readers. So he writes in his study, given that many readers apparently gained a heightened awareness of climate justice and came to identify with climate migrants, do these results suggest that The Water Knife is an unmitigated success as a vehicle of creative climate communication? Not so fast. So the reality is that the readers also took away various other messages in addition to concern about climate change. So many of the people, many readers of this novel actually took with them from the novel ideas that about how people really are, their true human nature. And Schneider-Meyerson writes, The Water Knife portrays a world in which a conservative perspective, conservative meaning a politically conservative, kind of a perspective that's not concerned about climate change, and that has a somewhat cynical view of human nature, defined as the self-interested pursuit of individualistic goals, has become dominant. Since this is just the way the world works, it justifies the decisions by all actors, that means all the characters, to behave accordingly. And so one of the key characters in the novel, named Maria, he writes at the bottom here, affirms a central refrain of the book that starry-eyed do-gooders who do not acknowledge basic truths about the world will pay the price. So it means you don't need to be loyal to anybody. All you should be concerned with is personal survival. And so it's a very Darwinian representation of the world, and it's really not a pro-social message. And so the point is, this work of climate literature not only presents messages about climate and concern about climate that the novelist probably wanted to convey, but also various ideas about human nature that seem detrimental to effective response to climate change. So my own reading, however, of climate literature, not only Bacigalupi's novel, but various other novels, such as Geraldine Brooks' Year of Wonders, and the Heller novel that I mentioned, Lawrence Wright's novel, The End of October, and there's a long list of climate novels. My sense is that actually reading pandemic texts or plague texts can help us overcome what eco-critic Kate Rigby has called complacent human self-enclosure. She argues in her book Dancing with Disaster that reading of these kinds of narratives makes us aware of our connections to other human beings and to the world, that helps us overcome complacency and to be more sensitive and more committed to positive action. And what I hope to do in some of my future empirical studies is actually to gather some concrete data about this. So I'm currently writing an essay called Toward Critical Self-Reflection and a Healthy Sense of Precarity, Why Read Pandemic Novels During a Pandemic? And the type of work that I'm doing is related to other recent studies in the environmental humanities, such as Sarah McFarlane's 2021 book, Eco-Collapse Fiction and Cultures of Human Exceptionalism, in which she argues that it's very important for us to recognize the vulnerability of the human species to extinction, rather than thinking that we are exceptional, that other species might become extinct, but human beings somehow are different. She argues that there are certain types of narratives, and she writes about 3 novels in her text. These narratives might help us recognize the fallacy, the inaccuracy of the myth of human exceptionalism. And so this is part of the conversation that we're having now in the environmental humanities. And my work, I think, is an element of this. So this is my last slide. My guiding question is whether we can use certain concepts from psychology and the environmental humanities to understand how narratives might spur a healthy sense of mindfulness and urgent caution in readers, and help people become more sensitive to the difficult to perceive and difficult to understand processes of slow violence. So I think I'm going to unshare my screen and open things up for questions now. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Dr. Slovic, for such an interesting and enlightening presentation that has given us food for thought. Some of the professors here at the School of Languages are running research projects in ecocriticism and the environmental humanities, and there are many graduate students that are enrolled in MA programs, and they might be interested in doing research in the field. So if it's fine with you, we will open a brief question and answer section. right? So probably you can raise your hand and I will give you the opportunity to talk. I think Viviana Asturiano, did you raise your hand? Okay. So would anybody like to start? Ask any questions to
I
Dr.
see
Slavic.
Tatiana has a hand up.
Okay, please speak up then.
Hi, good evening. First of all, I'm really glad I have the opportunity to participate. It was really interesting, and I think it's a really current topic nowadays. I've been having this discussion with many friends, specifically about the war in Ukraine, this thing of numbness. We've been overwhelmed with videos, photography, news on the internet about the war, and somehow we have become numb to it. We're getting used to the disaster of war, even though at the beginning it was kind of different for us. I mean, we are used to reading about wars in I don't know, other parts of the world, but not in Europe. And this related to the environmental disasters that everybody is witnessing right now. You mentioned that sense of hopelessness as part of the reactions to literature. And isn't there a danger that this hopelessness or this numbness might be increased by reading and getting used to the idea that the world may come to an end, that the human species may become extinct? So we psychologically get prepared or start preparing ourselves, embracing ourselves to the idea that there's nothing we can do. Specifically here in Latin America, there are so many urgent problems. So we decide to shut ourselves down to that news, to those kind of news, and try to avoid the topic. I mean, we talk about it, we say, oh, it's so anguishing, we are getting so distressed about the ideas, but then we continue with our lives because there's nothing we can do. We read about this and we are getting ready, we are going to die, and the world's going to come to an end. I mean, how can we avoid that? Maybe literature may contribute to this problem. Isn't that possible?
That is a great question. You stated it really well. I can see exactly what you're saying. I think I guess I'm revealing my own cultural perspective in designing these kinds of studies, and what I tend to see is a sense of how should I put it? As I put it earlier, complacency. People are just living their lives not out of fear about precarity, but out, it's just life as usual. The problems of the world are far away, and we should just, maintain our happy lifestyles as if there's nothing to be concerned about. So I guess the way I have designed some of my studies is to try to poke a hole in this complacency and say, wake up, pay more attention. We are all in a condition of precarity, and it is healthy for us to be experiencing this precarity. But from the perspective that you're describing, actually, I think maybe we need to be exploring narratives of empowerment. How can we, so not to make people feel more precarious. I see exactly the danger of having people shut down and protect themselves from an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. And what we need instead, perhaps, in order to give people an encouraged idea that they might actually make a positive difference, not only in their own lives or their immediate social circles, but against the larger phenomena of the world that are so threatening, would be to find narratives of empowerment, and to see whether these kinds of narratives are contagious in the sense of narrative contagion, or emotional contagion that I was describing earlier. When I was speaking to the documentary maker earlier today, that's what he was wondering about. Like, what are the stories that need to be told? And how could he best use his work as a scriptwriter for documentary films, or to design or these documentary projects, in order to tell the stories that people need, in order to give them a sense of how to live their lives and how to pay attention to these kinds of crises in the world. So it's one thing to break through the public's indifference, their lack of paying attention. It's another thing to tell people what they need to feel in order to act effectively, either to be concerned appropriately or to be empowered appropriately. So I'm thinking about your question, and it seems to me that the issue of pseudo-inefficacy is important. Inefficacy means we feel that nothing we do will have a positive effect. That if we have efficacy, we can make a positive difference. If we have inefficacy, we don't have any power. But pseudo-inefficacy means we feel as if we have no power, when in reality we do have power. Even in overwhelming situations, even with the war in Ukraine, there are little things we could all be doing, that would help to make a difference if we added it all together. So I don't want to say that sending money to aid organizations is the only thing we can do, but sometimes it's the most obvious thing that we can do. Or we can write to politicians and ask them to say something at the United Nations or in other situations. Or if we live in Europe, we can encourage our countries not to use so much Russian petroleum and to try to weaken the war, as by doing that. And in fact, using less petroleum probably is a good thing for global climate change as well. That's one of the ironic outcomes of the war in Ukraine, is that a number of countries in Europe, I think, are now planning actively to reduce their reliance on oil and gas in the near future, which will inadvertently have a very positive effect on climate change. So anyway, it's really interesting for me to hear your perspective, and I can see the danger of increasing people's normal sense of precarity. It's a good area for research, to look for other kinds of narratives and what kinds of impacts they have on audiences. Are there other questions about the field in general? It doesn't have to be about my specific lecture.
Yeah, Dr. Slovic, I personally have a question. I have been doing research on the relationship between COVID and climate change and epidemics, right? And I haven't found it that easy to find novels or narratives that deal with this. Probably my question is then, have you noticed an increase of texts that deal with fictional texts, I'm talking in the realm of literature, that deal with this connection of COVID, not COVID in particular, but epidemics and climate change? Has there been an increase after the COVID?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure enough time has passed for us to actually see many people writing about the specific connection between pandemics and climate change specifically. The production process, the writing process, and the book production process is slower than that. So I wouldn't be surprised if we did begin to see such novels in the next decade. But we have to.
My question is connected to what you said. I've never heard the words before, the term pandemic novels, right?
Okay.
We have been used to working with climate fiction, probably sci-fi. And I've been working, just by chance, I came across two novels that deal with an epidemic and climate change before the breakout of the COVID. Like Nube Rosa by an Uruguayan writer. And there is another one that is called The Dreamers by Karen, let me see if I remember, Karen Thomas Thompson Walker. And in a way, for example, Mugre Rosa, that was published by this Uruguayan writer, was published 4 months before the outbreak of the pandemics. And when you read the novel, it's just exactly what we went through these last 2 years. So when you were talking about this pandemic literature, my question is that constitutes in itself a new genre, or would you include it? It's more a formal question within climate fiction.
Yeah, no, I would, in general, call pandemic literature or plague literature a separate genre. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't put it within the climate fiction genre. But I imagine in the coming years, we may see some new novels that specifically address pandemics and climate issue together. So I'm less familiar with that combined focus in the fiction. There's plague literature is an old genre, and there are many earlier texts, including Albert Camus' La Peste, or the Plague, is one of the classic texts in plague literature. But many other works going even further back than that. But there have been a lot of novels over the years, and films as well, including popular films addressing disease, widespread disease, and the threat of disease. And there's also an important nonfiction genre of kind of pandemic studies. One of the important American environmental writers, David Quammen, wrote a book called Spillover in 2011. Many of the books I'm looking at are from 2011 for some reason. And Quammen's book Spillover is about zoonotic disease. And in fact, this Friday, I'll be moderating a speech that David Quammen is giving. This is his name, if you don't know his name. And on a new book he has coming out, a nonfiction book about zoonotic transfer of disease, which is how the COVID pandemic occurred, passing from one species to another. So, but the field of plague literature is getting much more attention now among scholars than I've ever seen in the past. And I also think it's important for us to be thinking about how these types of plagues or pandemics and their effect on changing human culture might result in some kind of effect on global climate change because of our changed behavior, our different use of transportation, our conducting of events like this one through Zoom rather than through jet travel. So there may be certain ways in which we are beginning to have some kind of noticeable effect as a result of the pandemic. But I can, if you're in touch with me by email, I can send you a list of some of the novels that I've been working on.
Thank you, I will.
Yeah,
will.
Yeah, I see that there are some other hands.
Yes, Miriam, please. Miriam Carvalho, I think.
Hi, Miriam. Oh, you're muted.
Your microphone is muted, Miriam.
Okay. Hi, Scott. Nice to see you again. But I think Monica is before me, so if she wants to take up the floor, and that's okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Very interesting, Scott. As usual, you have delivered a very interesting presentation. But with your ideas, I thought about the convergence of many types of criticism. I thought about ethical criticism, which also thinks the analysis works in terms of, well, what are the ethical values that you can discover in literature? I also thought about Baudrillard, and this is something that Tatiana also mentioned, how the exponential use of repetition of images tends to have a trivialization effect. So all the effects of multiple messages and the relationship between literature, creativity, and the effect, which is something, for instance, I found it a bit disturbing that a film writer or a film director would consult somebody in order to have an effect on the audience, because And in linguistics, we have that type of studies, for instance, critical discourse analysis, and how the power of discourse can manipulate audiences. Well, in fact, linguists do not do it for that purpose, but our studies, that kind of study can be used for other purposes. So that's why I find it disturbing, but very interesting at the same time. And I also thought about the effect, which is very difficult to measure. And for instance, when the 9/11 event took place, it was very difficult to find the narrative that addressed that. Or for people who have experienced the loss of people, of the dear ones, the beloved ones, to read the excerpt that you read about this woman dying is so disturbing that it's very difficult to absorb it. So I think that the effect on literature, or for instance, if you think of the film Life is Beautiful, I think the Italian director or that wrote about the Holocaust in a humorous or in a positive way, let's say. So that is very difficult to know about the effect. But in any case, I think it is very interesting, but I'm always concerned. I think that probably creativity is something that runs without controls, and it's interesting that we analyze the cognitive processes, but it's so difficult to measure what is it that makes something strike in one way or the other. Well, a couple of ideas about all these problems.
These are very profound questions and problems, and I agree with you that they're provocative and disturbing as well as illuminating. And one of the reasons I'm studying these kinds of things is that I don't have the answers, and I want to know more. And I guess I'm not content with business as usual as a literary scholar, where I sit with my computer and my text and I invent ideas and I pretend to have answers that I know that I don't really have. So I think I'd like to try to gather more data so that I can speak with somewhat more authority about these kinds of issues. I agree with you about the passage from Peter Heller's novel, The Dog Stars. It's a very disturbing passage, but it's one small passage in a large novel. And most of the novel is actually very beautiful. It describes this man's peaceful life. He's by himself, living with his dog. He's a pilot of a small airplane. And so all of the people are gone, and he flies over the landscape by himself, looking at the beautiful world. But he's by himself, he's alone. He's lost his wife and everyone else that he cared about. So it's a life of terrible bereavement and isolation. But most of the novel is presented in very beautiful language. And then there are these moments of extremely painful memory. And so it's possible that embedded within the larger novel, the telling of such scenes will have an even more pronounced effect on readers, more poignant and powerful effect, because it comes as a flashback in a larger story where he's kind of overcome the sadness of the particular moment of losing his wife. And as far as communicators, journalists, and filmmakers seeking out advice from scholars, I agree with you that there's something a little bit disconcerting about the possibility that they'll be using advice from us to manipulate audiences. They'll use certain psychological principles in order to frame their work to have an effect. And yet they're doing this already. Writers, they're doing it more intuitively and accidentally. And I think it's interesting for us to consider cooperating with each other so that the artists, the filmmakers and storytellers have a sense of how they can be more more effective and more productive. They're trying to make people care about the world. I basically support the goal of this filmmaker. He wants people to know about the dangers that we're facing in the world and how, the concerns, and very interested in social justice and other such matters. And if some of these ideas can support that work, I guess I would rather make a mistake by supporting it rather than avoiding such communication. So I want to let a few other people make comments and offer questions. But thank you, Miriam.
Thank you. Monica.
Thank you. Thank you for such a thought-provoking presentation, Scott. And I was thinking about what Tatiana and Miriam said about this insensitivity and numbness that we have because of this overexposure to tragedy, and we seem not to care. It's too far away. Our everyday concerns are more important. And I was thinking of the concept of intercultural citizenship and how this that you propose of the power of literature to raise awareness comes very close to this concept, because as a teacher trainer, we need to develop empathy and tolerance and awareness of the others. So I think this concept of intercultural citizenship that we are working with at teacher training colleges here in Argentina, what your contribution is so important to develop people who can teach others to become world citizens, because above all, we are not only Argentinians citizens, but we are world citizens. Mm-hmm. So I think that this comes to complete this concept of intercultural citizenship. And
yes, I'm sorry.
No. I wanted to say that. And going back to what you asked, Maria Jose, there is a very interesting novel by the Argentine writer Samantha Schweblin, Distancia de Rescate, in which she discusses environmental issues and this maternal view on what happens to the environment. So I think there are many narratives in many languages which are aware of this, and writers raising their voices about this.
Perhaps, thank you, Monica. Perhaps on a very fundamental level, in a principle in intercultural citizenship would be that there's perhaps nothing absolutely different between ourselves and the other, any person. No. Now within our own society and in a distant society, and we may have a reflexive feeling that we don't have to be interested in people who are far away and who are quote unquote different than us, but to appreciate commonality is maybe a first step toward this idea of shared citizenship and a necessary bond that we have with other humans. I was particularly fascinated when I read this article by Amy Donovan, and I talked about the interview that I did with her, which you can read on the internet. It's at the Arithmetic of Compassion website. She works on trans-species empathy. And you might think, well, how can we ever have any deep feeling of empathy with a species that's very different than ourselves? And even though whales are mammals, she's writing about right whales, a very famous type of large whale, they live in the ocean. They live in darkness. They swim during their lives. They're different than we are. And yet she writes about the imaginative process of developing empathy for a species that is so very different from ourselves. And I think there are a lot of lessons in that effort to achieve trans-species empathy, lessons for intercultural citizenship and the ability.
That's what I was thinking about. Tolerance, empathy, that goes hand in hand.
So I'd be fascinated to know what you think of what she says about trans-species empathy, and you know, the potential of that to facilitate interhuman empathy. And as far as overexposure, and that's one of the real challenges with information, is the danger of overexposure, to be overwhelmed and numbed, not just by large numbers. The theory of psychic numbing, the concept of psychic numbing refers to the use of numbers. As soon as we start talking about large groups of people being in danger, we become numb. We care less and less about the individual lives at stake, human lives or other lives. But
if we can give them a face through a novel or through a short story, it becomes more significant.
But the problem with overexposure is if it's one face and then another face and then another face and then another face, it's too many faces. It's like a Zoom screen full of faces. and we have another type of psychic numbing. We see the faces, but we can be numbed. Imagine if our screens were larger and we saw an entire wall full of faces. That would be overwhelming and numbing. So the point of singularity is that we see the many through the one. And we need a really, as you know, in a good short story, a good novel, or a good nonfiction narrative, we're presented with a single primary character and a primary narrative that through which we look to see a more collective story. That we need to have our attention focalized on an individual, because that's the way the human imagination works. So there's a danger of overexposure, even through story, if there are too many stories, too many characters. I think that's one of the lessons of the psychology. And that, I don't know whether this is helpful in relation to the previous point about psychologists and literary scholars helping filmmakers to tell better stories so that they can achieve greater impact with their audiences. But I think to have them focalize the narrative and not diminish the effect by telling too many stories that start to spread out the empathy of the reader, but really to have a primary character. Even if they present some satellite stories, there should be a primary story that will help us to as audience members to focus our attention on that. Right? These may be antidotes to overexposure and overwhelming the audience and leading to us not to care any more than we did in the first place. So I think the point is to achieve a certain poignancy that enables people to appreciate the meaning of their lives and make sense out of what's happening in the world, and possibly understand how to act, how to move forward in our lives so that we feel as if we have a certain degree of power in order to help create the kind of world that we want to live in.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Marianela has a question.
All right. Thank you, Scott, for this insightful lecture. And I think my question is quite connected to what Monica was saying, because I was thinking I wanted to know if you could share your ideas in connection to the concept of the Anthropocene, these large-scale phenomena, and what can we do so as not to feel numb? What about our individual agency and the collective agency? How can we go from this individual sensitivity that you were mentioning towards a sort of collective results or positive results? And if we could connect back to the power of stories that you mentioned.
Yeah, well, it's very difficult not to feel overwhelmed and powerless. It's a conundrum. It's a conundrum, and many of us are thinking about this in the humanities, the arts, the social sciences, trying to solve this conundrum. And there may not be a simple answer, and there also may not be an answer that is as equally valid in every culture. So it may be culturally determined to some extent. But I do think it's important for us to train ourselves, to educate ourselves, and to perhaps develop our minds so that we can intuitively move from the individual to the many, from the one to the collective. And one of the very interesting examples of an artist who's attempting to help us move across scales from the small to the large and back to the small is a photographer and filmmaker from Seattle, Washington, named Chris Jordan. And I conducted an interview with him that's in the book, Numbers and Nerves. And so he has a website, chrisjordan.com. And he basically, he takes images, and I wish I could just call up his website and share my screen and show you. I probably could if we had a minute, but he actually, his goal is to demonstrate what he calls the trans-scalar imaginary, moving across scales in order to basically to help us develop a new way of thinking that enables us to survive the Anthropocene. So Florencia is saying that I can do this, so I'm going to try to do it right now. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you see what's on my screen? This image of birds.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, so he creates many of these. What does he call them? The term escapes me right now. These are kind of visual compositions, and this is. And he has a caption below each one. So this is a chrisjordan.com, and it's a series of images called Running the Numbers. And the caption here, it's called Silent Spring 2014. Remember, Silent Spring is the title of Rachel Carson's famous book from 1962 about the disappearance of birds. So underneath this image, it says, depicts 183,000 birds, equal to the estimated number of birds that die in the United States every day from exposure to agricultural pesticides. And that, which is, of course, the topic of Rachel Carson's famous book, which produced the modern environmental movement. So Carson writes about it in a more technical, scientific way. But think of the different level of poignancy when you see this. It looks like a relatively abstract image, and then when you click on it, it moves. It comes toward you, and you begin to see the individual birds. And this is trans-scalar movement across scales from the many to the individual. So you realize that each one of these small dots is an individual bird. And the way these birds are coming toward you actually kind of see their eyes. So let me see if there are some others here. Okay, so this is a climate change image. Depicts 2,400,000 pieces of coal, equal to the estimated number of pounds of carbon dioxide being emitted into the Earth's atmosphere every second by the human burning of fossil fuels. So it looks like it's just a black screen when we're in the distance. And then when we hit it again and it begins moving toward us, you start to see the individual pieces of coal. Something's not working here.
There is a face as well there.
face. I don't.
Yeah, I can see a mask or something like that if you go back.
It's so
Oh,
It's
well,
alive.
it's like the Isla de Pascua, the Easter's island masks.
Oh,
Okay. Didn't you
oh,
see
that
it?
one too. This one up here.
No, there in the when you zoom
in the coal.
zoom in out.
In the coal. Oh, I
Yes.
couldn't see that on my screen. Yeah.
You didn't.
Oh, look at this one here. This is a famous one. Venus,
Botticelli.
2011. So the famous Botticelli painting. But this one is different. It's a digital composition, and the caption says to take 240,000 plastic bags, equal to the estimated number of plastic bags consumed around the world every 10 seconds. So when you hit on it, you see these are actually individual plastic bags. Can you see the bags now? So anyway, so this is called the Transscalar Imaginary. And Jordan talks about it in this interview, and then he has many artworks on his website where he's attempting to use the medium of digital composition to basically to train people to think from the one to the many in order to grapple with these large-scale phenomena in the Anthropocene. These are issues, this goes back to the question about the Anthropocene. In the Anthropocene, there are many phenomena that seem to occur on this very large scale. It's easy to be overwhelmed by the social crises and the environmental crises. We don't even know how to use our minds to contemplate these. And so one of the approaches is to learn to think across scales, from the small to the large, the one to the many. And artists like Jordan are attempting to use innovative techniques. This one requires a computer to use this computer algorithm to move, to create a still image that actually moves. And it simulates the process of being in an art gallery when you stand at a distance and then you walk up close to the work and then you move back again. But here you can do it on your digital screen. So I find it a very interesting example. And what I wonder is whether literary artists can do the same thing through certain types of storytelling, to simulate the movement across scales in order to help us all use our brains to live meaningfully during the Anthropocene. When we have information, but we don't know what to do with that information. We don't know quite how to process it, how to contemplate the information. So it's not a shortage of information that we have about the world. I think it's really a challenge of knowing what to make of that information, what kind of meaning to pull out of it, and how to allow it to guide us in our lives. So that's what scholars like me are trying to do. And it sounds like some of you are also working on similar issues. So.
There was one theorist that spoke about, can't remember his name, but spoke about the zooming in and out Google effect as a type of cognitive procedure that is typical of the Anthropocene.
Are you thinking of Ursula Heiser?
I don't think it was Ursula. I remember that it was quoted in the prologue of the Environmental Humanities, but it was they quoted somebody, but it was not Ursula. But I think it's the type of thinking that the cognitive procedure that the definition of the Anthropocene is trying to build. So the idea that there are scales that overwhelm us, and so we have to zoom in and out all the time.
Yeah, interesting. Well, Ursula Heiser, in her book Sense of Place and Sense of Planet, also writes about the Google Earth effect and the idea of kind of zooming out and then zooming into a specific place and finding a balance between a sense of one's individual place and one's personal attachments and the larger context of those attachments, which would be the larger Earth. Yesterday, I attended, or not, was it yesterday? It was I guess it was Friday, I attended a lecture by a scientist, a climate scientist from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Southern California. His name is Peter Kalmus, Kalmus, and he's the author of a recent book. I think it's titled Being the Change. He's a climate scientist who is working at the very cutting edge of earth science and what we know about the changing planet, including the climate. And he's desperately concerned, desperately panicked about what's going on with the world and the viability of future life on the planet, especially human life. And he says it's not enough for scientists like him simply to produce data and publish in scientific journals, because nobody is reading this. The people who need to be making decisions are not using the data, not using the information, not listening to the scientists. He actually wrote a review of the recent film. Some of you may have seen it, called Don't Look Up. And he said, that's it. That's exactly the way I feel as one of these scientists. None of the decision makers want to listen to me. I know how serious the situation is, and he hasn't been invited, to talk to the president, but in the film, the scientists go to the president's office and say, there's a terrible event that's going to happen. A comet is going to hit the earth, and the president is ignoring him. And the president's son, who's there in the office, is just making fun of the scientists. And then sure enough, the comet hits the planet. And this is the way a lot of scientists feel. And so they're trying to find more effective ways to communicate. So this scientist began his lecture with about 10 to 15 minutes of telling his personal story and how panicked he's becoming, and how he spoke to his wife about his decision to be arrested by the police, to go and chain himself to the doors of the Morgan Stanley Bank, in Los Angeles, and commit a crime of civil disobedience, to be arrested, just as a way of demonstrating that he is extremely worried that the public is not paying enough attention to the seriousness of the situation. And so the act of getting arrested is not the important thing. The act of telling the story is what's more important. He was in jail for a few hours, but then he came out of jail and he began telling his story, that he takes this problem so seriously that he's attempting to convey effectively this issue. So in addition to helping us understand the relationship between our personal lives and the larger story of the planet, I think to convey a sense of urgency is particularly important with a lot of these situations, whether we're talking about the war in Ukraine or other kinds of social crises that may be happening closer to home, perhaps even in Argentina, or whether we're thinking about planetary environmental crises. We not only need to convey urgency if we're communicators, but we need to feel urgency in our own lives in order to respond effectively. And at least in my society here, I don't really feel a strong sense of urgency. People are just getting along with their daily lives. And but when the pandemic hit us, everyone stopped. Everything stopped. People stopped going out. They stopped driving. They stopped flying. In many ways, our lives changed. So we know how to stop and make certain changes when we need to, when we feel a sense of urgency, and in our case, when we feel a sense of precarity. And so I just feel that we may need to replicate this feeling of urgent precarity in relation to other kinds of planetary problems. It looks like someone else may be trying to.
Yes, that's right, Dr. Slovic. There is a participant. She wants to ask 2 questions. But first, I would like to ask if you have some time left.
I'm okay. I'm fine. Yes, thank you.
Okay. So it is in the chat, and it says whether an empirical approach is the only methodological approach followed in the field of ecocriticism, or other more traditional types of analysis are also possible and are considered as valuable as an empirical study. That is a question from Andrea. And then you have a second question there.
Yes, absolutely, yes. There are many viable and important approaches in eco-criticism, and the empirical approach is currently being practiced by a relatively small group. There's the team of scholars that I mentioned, Schneider, Meyerson, Weik von Mosner, and Moetsky, who are leading the movement of empirical eco-criticism, but many other people are doing material eco-criticism, environmental justice eco-criticism, post-colonial eco-criticism, psychological eco-criticism, ecofeminist eco-criticism, and on, critical animal studies and eco-criticism, food studies and eco-criticism. There are many approaches, but I was trying to tell you the story of one of the experimental new attempts in the field, which I felt was particularly relevant to the pandemic experience, and the efforts to build off of the pandemic, to do environmental humanities research during the pandemic. We are still experiencing the pandemic. It's not finished. And during the pandemic, as we think about the pandemic, it seems interesting to try to learn from this pandemic and apply what we learn to other kinds of situations that require our attention. So please do not have the impression that it's only empirical eco-criticism that are valuable. People are doing many other equally important approaches right now. And then I talked about the fourth and fifth wave of eco-criticism. I've, over the years, have written about the many waves of eco-criticism. The first wave tended to be focused on non-human texts, on wilderness and the non-human, and on non-fiction texts, non-fiction pieces of writing. The second wave of and that wave occurred up to about 1980 or so. And then from 1980 to 1995, we began to see the emergence of a second wave of eco-criticism, looking at more multicultural texts and different literary forms, and increasingly at a variety of types of artistic texts in languages around the world. The third wave began to bring in fields like critical animal studies and post-colonial eco-critical approaches, much more interested in intercultural aspects, interspecies and intercultural aspects. And that really began around the year 2000. The fourth wave began around 2010, 2011, and emphasized empirical approaches and practical, the study of practical phenomena, not only artistic texts, but material culture, architecture, automobiles, waste, a number of studies of waste culture, garbage, and aesthetics. And it led to the publication in 2014 of the Material Eco-Criticism anthology. And then what I'm calling the fifth wave has to do with going public. The idea of environmental humanities scholars and eco-critics in particular, trying to find new audiences, not only writing for academic audiences, but publishing in newspapers, on websites, speaking to the general public, and sometimes writing, not just writing academic articles, but doing literary work, or trying to find new media in which to communicate some of the insights from our research to these broader audiences. It also includes writing letters. And so here I'm trying to build on some of the work that I was doing years ago, writing letters to CEOs of companies if I was concerned about what they were doing, and talking a little bit about the work that I do as a scholar, and attempting to persuade companies to be socially responsible. And to me, that sort of going public is a further extension of the work that we're doing. If we're concerned about humanitarian and environmental issues, then it seems to me that maybe we shouldn't always be content doing our professional work in the traditional ways, and that maybe we need to get out of our comfort zones and find new voices for communicating, new registers and new media, so that we can communicate with our fellow citizens in order to try to have a positive impact on society. And I've met quite a few other scholars in the environmental humanities who are doing the same thing. And so in my own classes, like my graduate seminars, I not only have my students write traditional academic research papers, but I ask them to write an op-ed as their final assignment. They write a seminar paper, and then they have to write an op-ed of maybe 800 words or so, just a couple pages, an op-ed that they could publish in a newspaper or on a website based upon their research. And to explain in an engaging, inviting way for a general reader why their research is important to the world. This is something that I've tried to do in my own work, publishing a lot of op-eds in the past 6 or 7 years. And I ask my graduate students to do that now as well. And this is an effort to get them to participate in the fifth wave and to think of the societal value of their work, not only for their own professional career, but for the positive effect they can have on greater society.
Thank you so much, Dr. Slovic. I give the floor to Florencia, because she might want to round off the talk.
Thank you very much, Scott. It was an excellent presentation, outstanding presentation. And thank you for being here today and for your willingness and enthusiasm when we invited you to give this lecture some time ago. I would also like to thank the audience. Thank you very much for your attention, for your interest throughout the presentation. And I would like to say towards the end that we started organizing these presentations for our MA students and the general public during the pandemic, and we want to continue doing that. So wait for more to come. Because we firmly believe that events of this kind foster professional and research development, which are two mainstays of graduate education at Facultad de Lenguas, Universidad Nacional de Córdoba. Thank you very much, Scott. Thank you very much. And you all please have a great day.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody. Ciao.
Bye-bye. Adios, Scott.
Adios.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.